All right. I think I'm also the dubious honor of being the first VC to present at this thing, so I better not shame my brothers and sisters. So I'm here to talk about whether it's harder to raise capital in Canada versus the US. And this is certainly something that I hear a lot about. And I've certainly heard every sort of reason under the sun as to why it might be harder. But I want to talk about a specific reason why it is harder tonight and hopefully educate you a little bit more on it and spend no more than 5 minutes on it. So basically, to raise capital, you got to follow the rules. And in the Valley, everyone knows the rules. You follow them, you raise capital, and it works out. The problem is in Canada, there's two sets of rules. They don't mix, and that's one of the reasons why it's harder. Okay, so let me give you a little bit of background about myself. Basically, all you really need to know from this is that I've programmed at startups, I've started them, I've raised capital for them. My first job was actually in the financial services, and I've been running my own public markets portfolio during that entire time. So net, I should be qualified to talk about this. I didn't read this on Quora and then regurgitating to you. So hopefully you can learn something from this. All right, so some caveats, because I've only got 5 minutes, and this is actually a really complex topic. There are other reasons it's harder, I'm not covering those tonight. This is really for tech companies only, biotech companies, pharmaceutical tech, blah, blah, blah tech. There are other reasons why it's harder for them. This is really only for software, but this is Tech TO. I think I'm in the right crowd, right? Yeah. Okay, good. All right. And I've made some massive oversimplifications in this because I only have 5 minutes, of which I've used like half of it already. All right, so here's your history lesson. So the public markets in Canada have been open for about a century and a half at this point. And in particular, the Vancouver Stock Exchange, or the Venture Exchange as it's now called, has been operating for almost a century now. And in that century, the Venture Exchange primarily raises capital for new companies, startups, but in a particular sector, which is natural resources, mining, oil and gas, so forth. And they got really good at it. At their peak, they are doing multiple billions a year in fundraising for these type of startups. And so the whole ecosystem built up around how to raise capital for these natural resource exploration company. So that's how it's done. Now, so let's talk about the typical Canadian startup, non-tech. This is kind of what its life cycle looks like. Huge caveat, there is no such thing as a typical startup, but play around along with me for a minute. So they raise $2 million, they put that into a shell, they go out find some assets, they explore those assets, they develop them, they IPO it, then they raise money in the public markets from that point forward. And you sort of give those numbers or sort of rough estimates of sort of the stages that they'll issue capital. What you'll notice at the top is the capital source, and the capital source is entirely public markets. Using flow-through shares, we do not have time to talk about flow-through shares tonight. And largely done with brokers and agents. Now let's look at the typical Valley company. Let me just flip back and forth. Can I flip back and forth? Oh, there we go. You see the difference? The numbers are actually pretty close to being the same. The major difference is the source of capital. So venture capital raises its money almost exclusively through limited partnerships. In fact, exclusively through limited partnerships, not through any sort of public markets. So let's just sort of dive a little bit deeper into what the difference between those two look like. So the US tech funds, those limited partnerships gets their capital from primarily three major sources: pension funds, foundations, and corporations. They're private, as we just talked about. Their duration is limited to 10 years, not a day more, not a day less. There's no liquidity, there's no daily pricing. You cannot sell them, you cannot buy them. There are no agents that are used, and obviously VC, they have a lot of expertise in tech. Now let's talk about the Canadian public market. So it's a public market. That means anyone in this room who has a self-directed account, to mutual funds, to pension funds, you name it. They're all in those public markets. There's no limitation on duration. You can sell after 2 seconds. You can sell after never. Agents are, as I said, extensively used. And finally, there's limited expertise in tech in the public markets. The two honestly could not be any more different. And this is the next slide that really matters, is that they don't mix. US venture funds, actually venture funds anywhere in the world, do not invest in public companies. If they did, they'd be called hedge funds. And hedge funds and venture funds are two different beasts. We don't have time to go into it. I'm probably getting close to my time limit anyway. So if you ever want to raise money from a US venture fund, and I would suggest that you do, you got to stay private. You got to play by the rules. You can't play by the public market rules, despite the fact that Canada has a long history of raising significant amounts of money through public markets for new companies. You can't do it that way. So is it harder to raise money in Canada? It doesn't have to be. I'll give you some quick tips on some ideas. Number one, get educated. That's what I'm here tonight trying to do, especially to the founders in the room. So tell your friends about this. Please, please, please turn down the "we'll take you public" pitch. I've seen and heard this far too often. It's tempting, it's sexy. They'll tell you there's all sorts of upsides to it. Unfortunately, there's really only downsides for tech companies. Do your research, get to know the individuals in the community. There's not a lot of us in the tech community, in the venture community in Canada. That's probably the best Google search to start with, in case you're curious. And then the last piece of advice I would give you as a VC as a former founder, and really more as a founder than a VC, is get real help. Get people, other founders who have built tech companies, have done at least twice as advisors. That's probably your best source of help, more than anything else. I think I'm out of time, so that's it. I'll go to the questions. Look at that, right on 5 minutes. All right, any questions? Sure, at the back. So in equity crowdfunding, kind of, it fits into the private equity class. You're still issuing private equity. You're not issuing public equity. But the more crowdfunded it gets, the more and more it starts to look like public markets, which is crowdfunding at its purest. What are the main differences? That's a harder question to answer. Probably specialty. In the U.S. funds, when I was in the U.S. raising capital for some of my startups, it wasn't hard to find at least 5 venture funds that specialized in my particular area. I think in Canada there's less funds, and they're much broader than they are specialists. That's probably your main difference, but other than that, they're actually not that dissimilar. Sure, over here. The question is, and I've certainly heard this a lot, which is the mythical Valley startup starts with an idea and no customers and no traction. They're able to raise capital, but the Canadian version of that can't raise capital until they have multiple customers. I think the reality is much more complex than that. The reality is certainly, I spent over a decade in the Valley, built 2 companies there. Look, the VCs are just as smart there, if not smarter than they are here. And at the end of the day, customers is not the ultimate traction, not necessarily the ultimate thing to look at. You have to look at much more than that. Companies are a package deal. So some of the stories you hear of company raising capital in the Valley, there's often more to the story than what meets the eye. That's the simplest way. It's a complex answer, and we don't have all night, unfortunately. Any other questions? Here, right here. What do you think? Make it good one. It's the last one. That's a loaded question. The question is what impact does government have on venture capital in U.S. versus Canada? So in the U.S., there is no government investment in venture capital. For better or worse, I would probably say for better. Now, they're 40 years ahead of us when it comes to building their venture community. So I would say that currently the government involvement in venture in Canada is necessary. And they're modeled after a lot of other nations who have done it very successfully to jumpstart their VC communities with government funding. But we have to build a sustainable ecosystem that does not require doesn't require government money to be in it. But for now, if they left, it would decimate the entire venture community, and there wouldn't be any venture. There would be very little venture left in Canada. Thank you, everyone.